This video is brought to you by GiveWell. Only a few weeks ago, it looked like Assad was firmly in control of Syria. His forces occupied some 60% of the country and the vast majority of its population, and he was slowly but surely reintegrating into the international community. Today, however, everything has changed. In just the past week, rebels have taken the cities of Aleppo and Hama and are now moving south to Homs, where Assad's forces are preparing for what would essentially be a last stand. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the rebels' ongoing advance in Syria, why Assad's regime is truly on the brink of collapse, and what a rebel takeover would mean for Syria. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, when we did our last video on Syria only a couple of days ago, the rebels had just reached the northern outskirts of Hama, a city with a population of about 1 million people that lies to the south of Aleppo, down the M5 highway. At the time, we suggested that the most likely outcome would be for the rebels' advance to slow down, leaving control of Syria split between Assad, the rebels and the Kurds, who control the northeast. Now, however, Assad's position looks a lot more precarious, and on Thursday the rebels seized Hama with basically no resistance from Assad's forces, who withdrew to the next city along the M5, Homs. To make matters worse for Assad, there have been numerous reports of soldiers from his Syrian Arab Army, or SAA, defecting to the rebels as they arrived in Hama, and some reports that his forces are already withdrawing from Homs. It's hard to overstate quite how dramatic this is. For context, throughout basically the entirety of the Syrian civil war, Assad only lost control of 2 provincial capitals, Raqqa in 2013 and Idlib in 2015. In just the past week, he's lost control of Syria's 2nd and 4th largest cities. If the rebels take Homs, Assad's position will become basically untenable. Assad's position is already pretty precarious, having lost Aleppo and Hama, both because it's obviously embarrassing, but also because those 2 cities would have accounted for a non-trivial fraction of Assad's tax revenues. His finances were already strained, and further spending cuts will require political capital that he doesn't really have. Spending cuts are actually a big reason that the SAA have been so ineffective. Over the past few years, Assad has had to demobilise a significant number of troops, and he hasn't been able to raise salaries, which might explain why so many SAA troops have apparently defected. Short of funds, SAA troops have also resorted to setting up checkpoints or tolls to squeeze cash out of the local population, which would also explain why the rebels have been so well received in places like Aleppo and Hama. Anyway, if Assad were to lose Homs, it would be game over. This is because the fall of Homs would cut Damascus off from the Alawite areas along the coast, which form the base of Assad's support. For context, Assad comes from an ethno-religious group known as the Alawites, who have dominated Syrian politics since Assad's father Hafez took power in 1971, but only constitute a small minority. The CIA, for instance, estimates that Alawites account for just 15% of Syria's population, while Sunni Arabs account for an outright majority. The Alawite population is mostly concentrated along the coast, in and around the port cities of Tartus and Latakia. If the rebels were to take Homs, they would essentially cut off Damascus from Assad's Alawite base along the coast, leaving him in control of just the capital and politically weakened. Worryingly for Assad, it's hard to see him holding on to Homs at this point. The SAA have performed terribly so far, and neither Iran nor Russia, his 2 main allies, are able to lend him substantial support. Iran has tried to send some of its militias from Iraq, but they don't seem to have made a difference so far, and Israel has apparently warned Iran not to provide significant support for Syria, not only to reduce the risk of more weapons falling into Hezbollah's arms. While Iran would probably be willing to deploy its own troops, they wouldn't arrive for at least a week, which would probably be too late given the pace of the rebel advance. Similarly, while Russia is still carrying out airstrikes on behalf of the regime, it's too busy in Ukraine to lend troops. On top of that, there's been basically no fighting between the rebels and the Kurds, which would have helped Assad. For context, the rebels are made up of 2 groups: HTS, an Islamist outfit, and the SNA, which are essentially a Turkish proxy whose main job is to fight the Kurds in northeast Syria. When the rebels' new offensive began, there was some anxiety that it would trigger fighting between the Kurds and the rebels, but this hasn't happened. While there have been some occasional skirmishes, there's been no major fighting, and HTS even released a statement describing the Kurds as, quote, an integral part of Syria, although there's probably some tension between HTS and the SNA on this front. So if the rebels do take Homs, and then probably most of Syria, what happens next? Well, it depends on how the rebels, and essentially HTS, end up governing. There's basically a pessimistic and an optimistic take here. The pessimistic take is that HTS, which is essentially an al-Qaeda offshoot, ends up being a brutal Islamist regime. This would obviously be bad news for ordinary Syrians living under HTS, and would also probably give way to more civil war. The optimistic take, however, is that HTS govern in a more moderate fashion. This might sound naively hopeful, but there hasn't been any ethnic cleansing of Syria's Christians in Aleppo that many commentators were worried about. And there are even rumours that HTS are considering appointing a Christian bishop as Aleppo's mayor. HTS's leader, a guy called Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, who used to lead al-Qaeda's Syrian offshoot, Jabhat al-Nusrat, even told CNN that he wanted to implement a legal framework in Syria to protect all minorities and sects, and that HTS would be dissolved, quote, when the time is right, so that Syria doesn't end up being a dictatorship again. Now, you might just think that Jalani is lying to win support from the international community, and that, once in power, he'll turn Syria into a Mediterranean Afghanistan. But it's worth noting that HTS's moderation actually began a few years ago, when they were in charge of Idlib. In short, HTS shifted away from al-Qaeda or ISIS-style Islamism, which aimed to create an international caliphate governed by Sharia law, towards an Islamist-tinged form of Syrian nationalism, mainly focused on usurping Assad while keeping together the Syrian nation. In this vein, they developed good relations with other minority groups, especially Christians, inside Idlib, and set up a salvation government with 11 ministries that's developed a degree of technocratic expertise over the past few years. Now, Jalani might just be acting out of self-interest here. He's infamously power-hungry, and might just have realised that the only way for him to hold on to power is to make himself palatable to both ordinary Syrians and the international community. Nonetheless, even if this is the case, it at least means that there's a chance that Assad's fall won't immediately give way to another civil war. Now, when you make a big purchase, say a car or a new mattress, how do you make sure that you're making the right choice? You could rely on all of the marketing copy in the product's ads, but many people find an independent resource that's rigorous and trustworthy. Today's sponsor, GiveWell, provides that independent resource for a different kind of purchase, a donation. For 17 years, GiveWell has been researching charitable organisations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities that they've found. That's things like bed nets to prevent malaria. It costs about $5 to provide one net. Nets can reduce the number of malaria infections. Enough nets and a large enough drop in infections can save a life in expectation. Together, over 125,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. I particularly like GiveWell, as it ensures that your money is doing a lot to help those the most in need. Here at TLDR News, we're big believers in doing research to find out what's really going on, and that's exactly the approach that GiveWell takes to charities. If you've never donated to GiveWell's recommended charities before, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org and pick YouTube and enter TLDR News at checkout. Make sure that they know that you heard about GiveWell from TLDR News to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.